Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for one final daily dose of Universes Beyond Assassin's Creed spoilers. So we've reached the end of spoiler season. It was a quick one, got it all done in like 3 days, but we still got a bunch of cards to talk about today, including one card that might be the most modern playable in the entire set, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking sweet new Assassin's Creed cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest previews throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk Assassin's Creed. So first up today, we get a new white uncommon that might actually be able to see some modern play in Tax Collector. So Tax Collector, 2-mana 2/2. When it enters a battlefield, you choose one. You tax your opponent until your next turn, spells your opponent's cast cost 1 more to cast, or you arrest your opponent. You detain target creature your opponent controls until your next turn. It can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated. So if you think about this card, it's essentially Azorius Arrestor mixed with the Thalia option, kind of a better Thalia. The downside is it's only a one-shot, right? You're taxing your opponent for 1 turn. Thalia sticks out and taxes turn after turn, but taxing every spell rather than just non-creature spells is actually pretty powerful. So how could this card potentially see modern play? I will say, as a one-shot, I don't think it's good enough. If you're just casting this as a grizzly bear that like makes your opponent play off curve for a turn or detain something for a turn, I don't think that's powerful enough to see modern play. However, in new modern, we have Thalia Exuberant Shepherd, which really likes to bling things, and we've also seen kind of a resurgence of Ephemerate thanks to Thalia. So in a deck where you're playing Thalia and Ephemerate and you have Tax Collector, you can kind of build this into a better Thalia, right? Where every turn you're Thalia blinking Tax Collector, Ephemerate blinking Tax Collector. If your opponent has to pay 1 more for their spells for the rest of the game, that's actually a super duper powerful effect. Plus, you have the option if your opponent has a lethal threat, or you can get in a big attack for lethal damage, you can always choose the arrest mode to get rid of an attacker or a blocker for a turn. So I think in some sort of blinky, taxy, ether viles type shell, thanks to Thalia and Ephemerate, Tax Collector could actually serve a purpose in modern. We also got a new mono green / in Commander Golgari thanks to the Disguise ability legend in Aveline de Grandpre. So it's a 4-mana 3/3 legendary human assassin with Death Touch, and it says whenever a creature you control with Death Touch deals combat damage to a player, put that many counters on that creature, and then you can disguise it for 2 mana. So you play it face down as a 3/3 with no abilities except for Word 2, and then flip it up for 2 mana. So this card I think is actually kind of interesting. Specifically as a Death Touch commander, we do have a few cards in Magic that specifically care about your creatures having Death Touch. Finn the Fanebearer might be the most well-known, giving all your Death Touch creatures poison 2. Hooded Blightfang wants you to be attacking with Death Touch creatures. Vraska puts counters on your Death Touch creatures. So I can see a way that this could be kind of an interesting commander where you just jam together as many Death Touch payoffs as possible and trust that Aveline is going to grow your team super quickly. Plus, you don't even have to play all Death Touch creatures. There's cards like Orin Frostfang, Bow of Nylea, Seraph that can give your entire team Death Touch, and they work really well with Aveline. So I think this will be a somewhat popular build around. It's also kind of a cute Nazgul commander because it is Golgari. All the Nazguls have Death Touch. They also care about counters, so the synergies work really well. So if you want to mash together Assassin's Creed and Lord of the Rings for some reason, Aveline Nazgul seems kind of like a cute way to do it. So Aveline, it's not going to see play in modern. Is a 4-mana 3/3, even with Disguise, it's just not really powerful enough on its own to see play. But in Commander, if you want to build a Death Touch deck, this is a pretty sweet option. We also got a pretty interesting mythic artifact in Staff of Eden's Vault Key. So Staff of Eden Vault Key, 6-mana legendary artifact. When it enters the battlefield, you can put target legendary permanent, not named Staff of Eden's Vault Key, from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So it reanimates a legend essentially, and then you can tap it and draw a card for each permanent you control but don't own. So this card intrigues me. It's 6 mana. I don't know, it could have uses in Modern, I guess, out of like the Karn board, where maybe you need to reanimate a legend for some reason in your Karn deck. I could see that being a possibility, but I think this is mostly designed to be a commander card. So at face value, with no shenanigans, let's say you just play this, reanimate your opponent's best legendary permanent, you essentially build a Staff of Nin. You're not getting damage, although the damage with Staff of Nin doesn't really matter. You're just able to tap it and draw an extra card every turn, because you reanimated one of your opponent's things, you control a permanent you don't own. So that's kind of the floor of this card. The other option for this card is to play it as a reanimation spell in some sort of probably legendary themed deck. I guess it could also go in an artifact themed deck, although I think Legends is probably the most common way for it to go. The problem here is some colors already have a lot of options for reanimating legends or permanents. So you got like Primeval's Glorious Rebirth for 1 more mana, reanimates all your legends. Squirming Emergence for 3 mana can reanimate a permanent. Invoke Justice, Invasion of Tovolda. So it really depends on your build. If you're in black or in Golgari or even in white, you might not need Staff of Eden, or maybe you play it as like a backup reanimation effect, but this is a cool option for legendary themed decks that are not in the typical reanimation color. So maybe you're playing Doric, which is kind of a legendary theme commander that's in mono green. This is kind of your only reanimation option, right? Or maybe you're playing mono blue Flibblethip Legends. You don't have any of those other reanimation spells, so Staff of Eden gets it done, and I think that's the power of this card. It's a reanimation effect that you can play in literally any deck because it's colorless. The other place this card will be really sweet is in Theft decks. So in Theft decks, you don't even really care that much about the reanimation effect. Like, you do, it's not a bad thing. It's a nice bonus that you can reanimate a legend, but in a Theft deck where your whole game plan is just stealing your opponent's permanents, stealing their creatures, playing off your opponent's deck, then the card draw mode on Staff of Eden becomes very powerful. If you have 3 or 4 or 5 of your opponent's permanents, this is tapping to refill your hand every turn, which is ridiculously strong. So I think this card could show up in legendary decks, maybe some artifact decks, as a reanimation spell, especially if you're into the colors that don't typically get reanimation, and it seems like a staple for Theft decks everywhere. We also got a unique new equipment, an Excalibur Sword of Eden. So 12 mana legendary equipment, but it costs X less to cast, where X is the total mana value of historic permanents you control. So if you get a bunch of artifacts or legends or sagas on the battlefield, it gets much cheaper, and then it gives equip creature +10/+0 in vigilance, and you can equip it to a legendary creature for 2 mana. So apart from Monty Python and the Holy Grail jokes, which might be the primary purpose of this card, the card's interesting. It kind of compares to Colossus Hammer, is an equipment that just gives a huge power burst. To Colossus Hammer, +10/+10. Excalibur, only +10/+0, but still, if you're putting this on like an evasive creature or equipping it after blocks are declared, it's getting in just as much damage as Colossus Hammer. So can this be Colossus Hammer 2.0 in Modern? And the answer is, I think it's too risky. So if you look at a Hammer Time deck in Modern, the issue is it's not going to do a very good job of reducing the cost on Excalibur. Sure, you probably have some artifacts. You might have like a legend or 2, although it's not typically a very legendary heavy deck. So it's going to be very difficult to get the cost of this down below like 8 mana or something, which you're just never going to be able to cast in a Hammer Time deck. However, Stoneforge Mystic does let you get around this. You can Stoneforge 2-or up Excalibur, use Stoneforge to put it into play for just 2 mana. The problem there is, if you don't draw Stoneforge, or if your Stoneforge dies, you're kind of playing a dead card. Why Colossus Hammer, it's only 1 mana, so you're always going to be able to cast it. The equip to a legend problem isn't actually a real problem. Like, yes, you're not going to have legendary creatures most likely, or many legendary creatures in a Hammer Time deck, but Pure Steel Paladin gets around that. You can equip it to anything. Sigarda's Aid puts it on anything, so that part's not really a problem. So the question is only really working with Stoneforge enough to make it good in Hammer Time in Modern? And my guess is it's just going to be too inconsistent. There's going to be too many games where the Stoneforge dies or you don't draw and you have this Excalibur left in your hand. So I don't think it can make it in Modern. On the other hand, it is pretty sweet in Commander. In Commander, it kind of reminds me of Blackblade Reforged. Is this equipment that can add a lot of power to a creature. Blackblade Reforged kind of scales slower because you need to get a bunch of lands on the battlefield, but in the late game, it is adding a bunch of power, and then you can equip it relatively cheaply to a legendary creature, So I think Excalibur kind of serves a similar purpose. Maybe the best home for this in Commander is Tetsu, because Tetsu specifically cares about the mana value of equipment attached to it. So Excalibur, you can cheat this into play on the cheap, hopefully by getting some other equipment and legends on the battlefield, but its mana value is always going to be 12, so it's going to deal a ton of damage, or let you cast huge spells for free with Tetsu. So I think it's a staple there, but really, I think this is worth considering in pretty much any equipment-based Commander deck, because if you think about it, in Commander, right, if you're playing an equipment deck, you already have a legend as your commander that's going to be 4 mana, 5 mana, 6 mana. So even just your commander is going to reduce the cost on this probably by half or close to half. And then if you add in other equipment, some mana rocks, which are also historic because they're artifacts, you can easily get the cost of this down very, very quickly to 0 mana. So I think in an equipment deck like Surgwin or Balin or Slicer is maybe the most hilarious home. Like, imagine getting this on a Slicer. You're passing a 13 power double striking Slicer around the table. People are going to die incredibly quickly. So I think any equipment deck can take advantage of this because so many cards are legendary and so many of the other equipment you're going to have in your deck are just naturally going to be historic because they're artifacts. So Excalibur, probably not going to make it in Modern, but in Commander, it does do some pretty sweet things. Next up, we get Loyal Inventor. So Loyal Inventor, a 3-mana 2/3 human artificer with vigilance. When it ETBs, you can search your library for an artifact card, any artifact card, reveal it, and then shuffle. You put the card in your hand if you have an assassin, otherwise put that card on the top of your library. So this card is very interesting to me. So it compares to a semi-cycle of cards that we've gotten over the years, the Trinket Mage cycle. So Trinket Mage, 3-drop blue creature, gets a 1-mana artifact. Trophy Mage gets a 3-mana artifact. Treasure Mage takes a great mana value artifact. So these cards are really powerful, right? Just 3 drops at 2 drop something else into your hand. Loyal Inventor has a huge upside over these cards. It doesn't have any mana value restriction. So in an artifact deck, Loyal Inventor can snag literally any artifact you want. You're not limited to 1 mana value, 3 mana value, 6+ mana value. The downside of Loyal Inventor is if you don't have an assassin, it works like a vampiric tutor rather than a demonic tutor, where you're putting the card on the top of your deck and drawing it the next turn, although I think that's probably still fine. Remember, you're a blue deck, so it's pretty easy to Loyal Inventor into a cantrip, get what you want right away, or blink it repeatedly so you can keep tutoring up artifacts. Plus, it's also possible you can throw an assassin or 2 in your deck to tutor it right to your hand. So I wouldn't say this is strictly better than Trinket Mage or Trophy Mage or Treasure Mage, but I do think a 3-mana unrestricted artifact tutor, even one that puts it on top of your deck some percentage of the time, and maybe a high percentage of the time, is a very playable card in artifact decks, in Commander in specific, where this is just going to get whatever artifact you need. Even if you gotta wait till the next turn to use it, I think that's still fine. So Loyal Inventor, pretty interesting new addition. Maybe could even have some modern ramifications. We've seen the white 3-drop that tutors an enchantment to the top of your deck. See play in certain decks that just really need a specific enchantment. Maybe Loyal Inventor can serve a similar purpose for artifacts. We also got Brotherhood's Regalia, a 2-mana equipment that gives equipped creature Ward 2, makes it into an assassin in addition to its other types, and it can't be blocked. You equip to a legend for 1, or you equip for 3 to anything. So Brotherhood's Regalia is basically an updated Whisper Silk Cloak. So Whisper Silk Cloak, a very, very powerful equipment, right? 3 mana, gives the equipped creature unblockable, just like Brotherhood's Regalia, and it gives it Shroud, so it can't be targeted. The weird thing about Whisper Silk Cloak, and one of the reasons it doesn't see more play, is giving the creature Shroud can actually oddly be a drawback, because if you give a creature a Shroud, you can't target it with abilities either, which means you can't load future equipment onto it, and that's kind of the main home for a card like Whisper Silk Cloak, is some sort of like Voltron-y equipment deck where you want to make sure you're getting in attacks. So I think that Brotherhood's Regalia is actually an upgrade over Whisper Silk Cloak in most of the decks that would want it, even though the protection's worse. It's Ward 2 rather than full-on untargetable, just because you can load up equipment onto it if you want to, and have the Brotherhood's Regalia. So I think this card probably going to see some play in Voltron-y style equipment decks in Commander, where you just load up a bunch of equipments, throw the Regalia on it, know you're going to be able to get in that hit to close out the game. We also got another free running card in Overpowering Assault. So Overpowering Assault, 5 mana, Untap all creatures you control that attack this turn. If it's your main phase, there's an initial combat phase followed by an additional main phase, and you can free running it for 3. So if you dealt damage with an assassin or a commander, you get to cast it for 3 mana. So this is essentially basically Relentless Assault, but free running. And I think the way they costed these free running spells, if you look at it compared to Relentless Assault, and a lot of the other ones look like this as well, is you're kind of paying a 1 mana tax if you're not free running. Like Relentless Assault, 4 mana, this is 5 mana, but then you get a 1 mana discount if you are able to free run it. So I think this card definitely serves a purpose. It should be very good in Assassin's decks, but I also think it can see play just as another extra combat phase style of card. Like, sure, it's 1 more mana than Relentless Assault, but there's just not that many sorceries that give you an extra combat step out there. So if the game plan in your deck is just to take as many combats as possible, I think you're fine with paying a 1 mana tax on this if you have to. Plus, remember, because free running works with your commander as well, even if you're not an Assassin's deck, some percentage of the time, you're going to be able to free run this just by getting in a hit with your commander during the turn. So in decks that want extra combat phases, the card actually seems really good. We also got Alexos of the Cult Cosmos. So a 4 mana 4/4 legendary human berserker. It is trample. It attacks each combat if able. It can't be sacrificed, and it can't attack its owner. And at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player gains control of it, untaps it, puts a counter on it, it gains haste until end of turn. So Alexos is essentially another Corona the False God, or Ruhan the Fomori, or Tangarth, or Karn, or I guess it's wearing an assault suit, essentially. But it's one of those cards that just passes around the table. Also, like Slicer is another one that we talked about earlier. It's one of those cards that, like, passes around the table. I think this is essentially fair Slicer in a lot of ways. It's Slicer, but you don't have double strike, so it's not going to be nearly as scary, even though it does grow itself naturally. But I think this card, if I was going to build around this effect, I'd probably just build Slicer as like the strongest version of it, unless you really like Alexos as a character for some reason. But in one of these decks, a Corona deck, a Ruhan deck, a Tangarth deck, a deck that your goal is to like give your opponents your stuff and make them damage each other, then I think this is a great 99 edition. We also got Desynchronization, and this is a card that, at first reading, I thought this card was really busted. Then I thought more about it, and now I'm not sure that it's busted, but it's a 4 mana instant, and it says return each non-land permanent that's not historic to its owner's hand. So artifacts, legends, and sagas are historic. So when I first read this card, I was like, oh my goodness, this is like the best mass bounce spell that we've gotten outside of Cyclonic Rift. Like, if you look at other options, Consuming Tide bounces all non-lands, maybe you draw a card, Devastation Tide bounces all non-lands. Both of them are sorceries. Obviously, Cyclonic Rift, always going to be the gold standard, I think, of this effect. So Desynchronization at 4 mana and instant speed seems kind of better than Consuming Tide, right? You even get the upside that maybe you're playing a legendary themed deck, you're a Joda deck and a Zika deck, you're going to bounce hopefully all your opponent's stuff and none of your stuff, because all your stuff's going to be historic. But then I thought more about it, and I realized this card actually has kind of a big issue, right? It's not really a Cyclonic Rift. It's not really a Consuming Tide, because your opponent's also going to have historic cards. All of their mana rocks, any artifacts are going to be historic. Their commander is going to be historic. And we live in 2024, when there's just been this huge creep of legends into the game, where it seems like every other creature that's printed, even just look at this set, pretty much every creature, like 90% or something, are legends. So there's more and more legends in the 99 that are just going to naturally be in your opponent's deck. So I think what this actually is kind of like the blue Urza's Ruinous Blast. Urza's Ruinous Blast is a card that's ridiculously powerful. Exiles all non-land permanents that are legendary. In the right scenario, this is one of the strongest wraths in the format. If you're playing a deck that's all legendary permanents, and your opponents happen to not be playing many legendary permanents, you can just absolutely get them. All the stuff goes to exile. It doesn't hurt your board. It wrecks your opponent's board. But Urza's Ruinous Blast doesn't really see that much play, because your opponents are probably going to have a lot of legends. So it's like a wrath that doesn't actually kill much of anything. And I think that's where Desynchronization ends up as well. Like, yes, there's going to be some scenarios where this card is absurd, where you're playing a legends deck or an artifact deck, you don't lose any of your stuff. Your opponents may be playing a token deck, or a deck that doesn't happen to have a lot of artifacts, doesn't happen to have a lot of legends. You bounce all their stuff, and it just like wins you the game on the spot. So those games will happen. But there's also going to be a lot of games where you want to reset the board, and your opponent opponent just has a bunch of artifacts, a bunch of legends, and this doesn't actually really reset much of anything. So I think it's going to be a very risky, matchup-dependent, gameplay-dependent card. So I don't think it's a staple. When I first read it, I thought this was going to be like a staple blue bounce spell, but then the more I thought about it, the more I think it's like, it's okay, and you can still get value out of it. If I'm playing a historic theme deck, I'm playing an artifact deck, a legendary deck, I probably would still play this. At 4 mana and instant speed, it's still a pretty good deal, even if it doesn't bounce all of my opponent's stuff. Even if it bounces half of their things, I'm still going to get a lot of tempo out of this, a lot of value out of the tempo of my opponent having to replay all their cards. So I think I'd still play it in those scenarios, but just keep in mind, your opponent's going to have historic stuff too, so it is more of a tempo play that's going to slow your opponents down, hopefully to some extent, than a full board reset. Speaking of full board resets, we did get a real one, a new white one in What Must Be Done. So What Must Be Done, 5 mana white sorcery. You get to choose one. You either Let the World Burn, which is destroy all artifacts and creatures, or release Juno, which is return target historic permanent card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It enters with 2 additional counters on it if it was a creature. So What Must Be Done? Interesting Wrath option. If you look at what to compare this to, the Wrath mode is kind of Cleansing Nova, but you get to choose both modes almost. It's kind of like a less flexible Steward Command or a cheaper Chroma's Vengeance that doesn't hit enchantments and can't cycle, blowing up all artifacts and creatures. That actually covers the most powerful and popular card types in Commander, right? Sure, it's not a full-on reset like a Farewell or an Onto Inversion, but getting all the artifacts and creatures, those are the most popular cards. That's what your opponent's most likely to have on their side of the battlefield, so it is a pretty nice reset. The second mode also offers a nice bonus. There's going to be some situations where you're doing all right, and you don't really want to Wrath the board, and that's one of the downside of Wraths, right? If you have a Cleansing Nova in hand, you're not always going to want to cast it. Well, maybe you're ahead on board. Why would you want to sweep away your own board? So this kind of solves that problem of a Wrath being stuck in your hand, because if you are ahead, then you can use the second mode to reanimate something and pull even further ahead to try to close out the game, which kind of makes it like, I don't know, I want to go with Invoke Justice as the closest option. Even though Invoke Justice gets any permanent and this only gets historic permanents, still kind of close enough as this 5 mana reanimation effect. So where does this fit in Commander? And I would say it ranks just outside of the top tier of Wraths. I think for me, the top tier of Wraths in Commander, Farewell, because it just does everything in Exiles. The card's so ridiculous. Vanquish the Horde I really like just because it's usually 2 mana, so it's the most efficient white Wrath. And then Onto Inversion because it's a land, so you can really cheat it into your deck almost for free as an MDFC. So I think it ranks just outside of that tier. It's kind of in the Cleansing Nova tier, the austere command tier of cards that I don't play in every deck because I don't really like to play that many Wraths, but I do play them in some decks. I think this is a Wrath that goes way up in value in a deck that's built around historic things. So if you're playing Kethis or Dahada or Shaunid, or you're playing some sort of artifacty deck, especially graveyardy ones, maybe Osgir or Gandalf, then I think What Must Be Done is actually probably good enough to make the cut in a deck like that. You get the Wrath mode, plus you get the option to reanimate something that's on theme with your deck. So I think What Must Be Done, not a Wrath that's going to make the cut in every single deck, but that's a good thing. I want Commander to be in a place where if I'm playing a Legends deck, the Wrath that's best for my deck is different than the Wrath that's best for my Enchantress deck, let's say, or my Tokens deck. So I really like this card. I think this card definitely serves a purpose in Commander, and if you're playing a deck that's built around historic permanents, I think this is more than good enough to make the cut in your deck. We also got a bunch more of the starter deck cards. So the starter decks, we talked about them on the first day of spoiler season. It's basically a new player product where if you're an Assassin's Creed fan who's never played Magic before, you can pick one of these up. It's got pre-built decks. The cards are relatively simple and easy to understand. None of these cards are really pushed for constructed. They're really designed to be played by new players, right? They're a little bit simple, a little bit maybe overcosted or underpowered compared to cards that are designed to be played in Modern or even in Commander. But like I said before, I really like this product. I think especially for Universes Beyond sets that theoretically are going to bring non-Magic players into Magic, I think a product like this that is designed for a brand new player who's never played the game before, really great option to have, even if it isn't for me or you or other more established players. We also got some interesting lower rarity stuff, including a couple of equipment that I really got to talk about, not because the equipment themselves are that good, but because I really think it's interesting the direction equipment design design is heading. So we have Hidden Footblade and Phantom Blade. Hidden Footblade, 1 mana, red equipment, and it has flash. When it enters the battlefield, you attach it to target creature you control. It gains first strike until end of turn, and the equipped creature gets +1/+0 in haste. You equip it for 2. Phantom Blade, maybe even more interesting. When it enters the battlefield, you attach it to up to 1 target creature you control, and then you destroy up to 1 other target creature. An equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has menace, and you equip for 2. So why are these cards, which I don't think you're going to see any competitive play, but why are these cards so intriguing to me? And for this, we got to go back to the history of Magic a little bit. So if you go back to the earliest days of Magic, back to the 90s, Magic had a problem. Spells were really, really good, and creatures kind of sucked. Creatures were really, really bad, and Wizards wanted to solve this problem. So how did they solve the problem of spells being too good and creatures not being good enough? They started to make creatures that worked like spells. We started to see Necrotals, which is essentially a removal spell, a terror, but on a body. We started to see Mana Wars, which is essentially an unsummon, but on a body. So Wizards started turning creatures into more powerful card types by giving them the same effects as spells as enter the battlefield triggers. And now I think we're seeing the same thing happen with equipment. Equipment, when they were first printed, were way too good, and then Wizards kind of overreacted and made them way too bad. So we went through like a decade where you could just never really play equipment in 60 card Magic. But now it seems like Wizards is doing the same trick with equipment that they did with creatures way back in the 90s, which is they're essentially turning creatures into spells. If you think about Phantom Blade, it's essentially a 5 mana sorcery speed murder, right? You just destroy a creature, but it's also an equipment, and it also is going to pump the thing that it attaches to. It's going to give it menace. So I think it's a really interesting way to try to make equipment a little bit more playable. So I don't think these designs in specific are going to be the designs that make equipment into all-stars that are, going to just change the game. But I think the more we see equipment with ETB triggers, the more likely it is that we're going to see playable equipment as they become more and more like spells, with the upside that they also work with your creatures, rather than just being these artifacts that are useless if you don't have a creature on the battlefield. So I really like the way that equipment are heading. These cards are super cool. I mean, I guess they're fine. You can play them casually. It's kind of neat that you can like tutor up a removal spell in Phantom Blade with your Stoneforge or whatever, but I don't expect them to see any, super constructed play or anything. Rounding things out today, we get some new sagas. So seems like there's a 3 mana saga cycle in this set. First up, Fall of the First Civilization, 3 mana white saga, lower counter 1, you and target opponent each draw 2 cards. So kind of like a mini secret rendezvous. Lower counter 2, exile target artifact an opponent controls. Lower counter 3, each player chooses 3 non-land permanents they control. Destroy all other non-land permanents. So essentially, card draw, artifact removal into a not exactly a wrath, but a pseudo-wrath. I think Fall Civilization, I'm actually a little skeptical of. I really don't like wrath effects that sit out on the battlefield, in part because it lets your opponent set up for them or deal with them before they go off, and in part because one of the ways your opponent can deal with them is by trying to kill you before it goes off. Your opponent might be, I really don't want that third lower counter to hit, so maybe I just try to kill Seth to make sure he never gets to the third lower counter. So the card, not especially excited for that one. The Astir Escape Valhalla, 3 mana green saga, lower counter 1, exile a permanent card from your graveyard. You gain life equal to its mana value. Lower counter 2, put a number of +1/+1 counters on target creature you control equal to the mana value of the exiled card. And then lower counter 3, return it and the exiled card to its owner's hand. This card I think could actually be pretty good. You kind of get this slow Eternal Witness effect, only for permanents, so you can't get back spells, but only for permanents. In theory, if the first lower counter exiles a 5-drop or something, the second lower counter is going to put a lot of counters on something, and then the last lower counter is going to let you start the process over and do the Eternal Witness thing of giving you the permanent back to your hand. So specifically in a deck that cares about +1/+1 counters, I think this card could be pretty playable in Commander. I also like that it gives you some incidental life gain. The only downside is it might be kind of competing with like literal Eternal Witness or Skullwinder, which just give you any card back to your hand right away. So you are paying a cost in time, right? There's going to be games where you just want to Eternal Witness back something that's going to win you the game right away, or you need a Wrath right now to save yourself from dying. the Astir Escape Valhalla isn't actually going to get that job done, but in a counter deck, I think it could be a nice backup Eternal Witness Skullwinder effect. The last one, Ballad of the Black Flag, this one I actually think is very, very interesting for artifact decks or for historic decks, especially of a graveyard theme. So 3-mana blue Saga, 3 lore counters, the first 3 of them, mill 3 cards, put a historic card from among them into your hand, and then 4th lore counter, historic spells you cast this turn cost 2 less to cast. So this card intrigues me because it's essentially a 3-mana draw 3 that also fills your graveyard. Yes, there is some chance that you whiff, right? Artifacts, legends, and sagas count as historic. There's going to be times when you mill 3 cards and don't hit any of those, but if your deck is heavily themed around artifacts or legends, that shouldn't really be much of a problem. So you get a 3-mana draw 3, a slow 3-mana draw 3, and then eventually you get some ramp, and we talk about all the time in Commander, what are the 2 most powerful things in Commander? Card advantage and mana advantage. Card advantage and mana advantage, and technically this card does both of them, so I'm actually intrigued enough by this card that in an artifact deck or some sort of legend deck, I'm gonna at least try it and see. I think it might be good enough, and I also think it doesn't really look scary enough for an opponent to try to kill. Like, yes, it's gonna generate some card advantage, but it's kind of slow, so I don't think your opponents are gonna really focus on removing it. So I think over the course of a few turns, odds are you are gonna get all 3 cards out of it and then the ramp. So I think in the right deck, Ballad of the Black Flag can actually be a pretty solid card draw option. We also got a couple of filler cards, a new vehicle that is just a little bit too slow, even though Island Walk is kind of cute. We don't see that very often. Towering Viewpoint. This card confuses me. 2 mana 0/4, Defender Reach, and then you can pay 3 to give target creature flying until end of turn. I'm very confused by this card. So to me, this looks like one of those cards that Wizards Prince and people are like, oh, we needed it for limited, right? Yeah, sure, it's not a great card, but limited needed it. The thing is, there's no limited for this set, so I'm not really sure why we'd put such a bad card in a set where there's no limited implications. I don't know what deck would ever play this card. I don't know, maybe there's some like super good Assassin's Creed lore purpose to it that I don't know about. So if that's the case, fine, whatever. But it seems very underpowered to me, and I just don't know why we need underpowered cards when limited isn't a concern. We also got Escape Detection, a 3-mana instant, has free running of bouncy blue creature you control to its owner's hand to return a creature to its owner's hand, and you get to draw a card. So in some sort of free running assassin style deck, this card seems fine. Like, you bounce one of your own things, maybe a Moldrifter or something else that has an ETB trigger, and then you get to bounce one of your opponent's things, and you get to draw a card. So not a staple or anything, but if you can trigger the free running consistently, and you have something that has an ETB that's worth picking up to reuse, then I think the card could be pretty good. Finally today, got a handful of reprints, nothing super crazy, but always good to have more Fatal Pushes and Path to Exiles, and also, coming to Modern for the first time, Reconnaissance. Reconnaissance, really powerful, like, sleeper commander card. 1 mana enchantment, pay 0, remove an attacking creature you control from combat, and untap it. So this is a way that you can freely trigger all of your attack triggers without worrying about losing your creatures in combat. You just swing and then untap whatever you want to. Actually a really powerful effect that you should probably play more in Commander, and this is one that I kind of wonder if it could work in Modern. It's technically another way you can combo with Nadu, although awkwardly you gotta do it during combat, which I think makes it worse than Shuko. I guess you could like attack and do a bunch of comboing to put a bunch of lands into play, and then go to your post-combat main phase and play some stuff to finish the combo, but it is another way you can repeatedly target your creatures for free as long as they're attacking. Plus, there could be some other shenanigans as well, so I'm actually kind of intrigued by what Reconnaissance can do, just because it's so efficient at what it does. Anyway, that brings us to the end of not only our daily Assassin's Creed spoilers for the day, but all of Assassin's Creed spoiler season. So now that you've seen pretty much the whole set, I think there might be one reprint left that hasn't been released yet. What do you think? Are you buying a box? Are you buying singles? Are you ignoring it and waiting for Bloomborough? What are you doing with this set? What do you think of the flavor? What do you think of the cards? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back in 2.5 weeks, I think, with some Bloomborough spoilers. So until then, everyone, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, check out the Ball Lightning deck we played in Modern here, and you can find yesterday's spoiler video right here.